as opposed to the Actinopterygii that just have proteinaceous fibers inside, strengthening their fin. Okay, those fibers may be calcified, but it is not a skeletal structure per se in the Actinopterygii. But there is, at the base, bony structures in the Sarcopterygii. In addition, the muscles that move the fin in the Actinopterygii, those muscles are all anchored inside the body. Right? So they're anchored in the body and then they extend out onto that fin. But in the Sarcopterygii, because you do have skeletal elements inside the base of the fin, you can also have other muscles that are being anchored on those skeletal elements out in the fin. So two big differences between those groups. The dipnoi, of course, are what? Yeah, the lungfish, that's all we need to say. We do have another large grouping called the Crossopterygii. It is paraphyletic, but it does contain this group of fishes, the Rhipidistia. The Rhipidistia I bring up for one reason, and that is that these are presumed to be the ancestors of amphibians, so the ancestors of terrestrial vertebrates. Actinopterygii, these are the most successful group on the planet. So Sarcopterygii, they're interesting because of the lungfish and because they're the ancestors of terrestrial vertebrates. The Actinopterygii, however, dominate fishes, right, from ancient times on, from what's called the Carboniferous times on. These are the dominant fish in the marine environment. Despite the presence of sharks and rays, we're dominated by Actinopterygii in the oceans. And virtually all fresh, there's only a couple of exceptions, all fresh water, freshwater fishes are Actinopterygii. Yeah, you got a few lamprey and stuff like that, and there are a couple chondrichthyes that come into fresh water, but most are Actinopterygii. Okay, so they dominate the marine environment, and they even dominate more in the freshwater environment. Okay, this is the most diverse group of vertebrates in terms of number of species and in terms of number of body forms. All right, so it's a very successful group. Lots of different species, lots of different body forms. And the success of the Actinopterygii is largely based upon adaptations for locomotion and feeding. All right, so they have some novel developments concerning locomotion and feeding that allow them to be so successful. In other words, to diversify greatly. So let's look at locomotion first, and then a little bit about feeding. Okay. So remember, early on, our fishes had these big, bulky, bony plates on the outside. And so it's equivalent to trying to walk around in a suit of armor. It limits you in what you can do. It does protect you, but it limits your mobility. Even after the ostracodon, as you start getting into the jawed fishes, those big bony plates became smaller bony plates, and then interlocking scales. So in other words, you had big blocky scales that would be butting up next to each other like that. If we looked at them on the side, they would be very thick. When you have these big blocky elements right next to each other, they don't move very well. Right? It's still a pretty solid structure. What occurs in the Actinopterygii is that we reduce those big bony scales or plates to very thin, flexible, overlapping plates of bone. So there is some bone in the scales of fishes, but we reduce them in size and we overlap them. That's going to do two things for you. One, it's going to greatly reduce the weight that you have to carry around, and it increases the flexibility of the animal. So we're looking at adaptations concerning locomotion that help make the Actinopterygii so successful. One thing that occurs is that in most of them, we reduce the size of those bony plates, and they're down to just very thin scales that overlap each other. That decreases the weight, increases our flexibility. Overall, we're a more mobile animal. The paired fins. The paired fins also become thinner and more flexible, and therefore more maneuverable. Right? Think of the shark that was in the bucket or in the jar, and anytime you've seen a shark. They have fairly thick fins. And not only that, if that's the shark, when that fin comes out, you have the basal part is very wide, and then it becomes small. They're very thick. The basal part is very wide compared to the distal. In an Actinopterygii, this is an exaggeration, but that can occur, does occur in many of them, so that we have the widest part of that fin is distal rather than proximal. Well, what this can do for you is increase the amount of water that is being moved with every stroke. Right? Whether it is used to turn or whether it is in those few fishes that are using their fins for locomotion per se, to propel themselves. All right? Because the distal part moves faster and now it is wider, we're going to move more water in any period of time. Gives us a more powerful way of doing it. Well, why don't these guys have it? Why don't the sharks have it? Well, one thing that the sharks use their fins for, besides a little bit of maneuvering, is that it does create lift and helps keep them from sinking to the bottom. They got a lot of oil in their body, that does it as well, but their fins create lift. If they stop swimming, many sharks are then going to gradually sink. There's a new development that we'll go into in detail later on in the Actinopterygii, and that is called a gas bladder. It's an alternative solution to the problem of sinking that develops in the Actinopterygii. Because they adopt this alternative solution, they can then modify their fins so that they become very thin. They can change the shape of their fins and use them to get better maneuverability. All right, so what we're going to end up getting is sharper turning, better braking power by having these thin fins with a different structure to them. So overall, what happens with the Actinopterygii is that we're becoming lighter. Right? We've got thinner scales, thinner fins. We're becoming more maneuverable, and we're swimming with less effort overall. Okay, all of those things are important in the success of the Actinopterygii. Feeding. There are three major things that occur in Actinopterygii. A couple of them that most species have, and